Baldur's Gate 3 is the third entry into the Baldur's Gate franchise. The series was originally developed by BioWare and Black Isle Studios in 1998. The previous mainline titles, Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2: Shadows of Amn, had both released to critical acclaim, but after the shutdown of Black Isle Studios in late 2003, the series was in limbo. In 2014, Larian Studios, hot off of Divinity Original Sin, proposed the idea of developing and producing Baldur's Gate 3 to Wizards of the Coast, but it wasn't until after Divinity Original Sin 2 that the wheels were put in motion. Baldur's Gate 3 finally released in August of 2023 after a little under 3 years in early access, receiving similar critical acclaim to the prior games despite now being in different hands. I'd like to take a critical look at the game now that the dust has settled, and I've had my time to sink my teeth into the game. To preface the video, I'll admit I don't have much experience with the franchise in Larian Studios. As of the time of recording, I haven't played either of the Divinity games or any of the other games in the Baldur's Gate franchise. My perspective as an outsider to Larian Studios and 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in general definitely colors my opinion of the game, but I think it's to the game's merit that I regard it highly despite that. I went into Baldur's Gate 3 blind. It's my preferred way to interact with most media. I had friends in my circle who played and put in a good word on the game's behalf, but I avoided it through its early access phase, and my entire playthrough was after patch 6. So in terms of experience, mine was fairly pure. I experienced almost no bugs, no crashes, and the game seemed to be polished, not that I'm not aware that wasn't the case on initial release. Overall, I have to give a solid 8.5 out of 10 for Baldur's Gate 3. I recognize I'm probably about a point away from the general consensus here, and I agree that Baldur's Gate 3 is a superb game. I'd rank it in my top 50 somewhere for sure. But I do have a differentiation of opinion along some lines that I'll get into later on. In terms of world building, the game does an amazing job of characterizing the existing continent of Faerun and the different races you interact with in that setting without rehashing too many high fantasy tropes. The gameplay on a whole is fun, interacting with characters, combat, exploration, they all work together in a carefully paced experience that gives you room to breathe, but not too much space for you to get away from the main attraction. The main story is well written and engaging, it has nuance and earns your respect early. It earns the ability to take you away from gameplay and makes you want to understand it, explore it, and find the path that best fits for your character and your playthrough. Now there are ultimately some pressure points in the story that I could see breaking a very heavily immersive experience. The almost simulation level of interactivity and the careful planning of the story and the contingencies the game itself has make a very immersive role-playing experience a reality for most, although of course not everything is possible, and those pressure points do have the possibility to snap you from that experience, which I can acknowledge even if it didn't specifically happen to me. You can do almost anything you want in the game, and interact with the story in almost any way you want, and that's the main appeal. Larian Studios took great care of making sure of this, and I think it shows in the community response. That's the most succinct, spoiler-free overview of the game I think I can give. So if you haven't played it already and need the push, let this be it. I think you could play the game, not enjoy it, and still be glad you had the experience anyway, which is a testament to the game itself. Baldur's Gate 3 does a good job of gripping you immediately. I'm not always the biggest fan of pre-rendered cutscenes, but I enjoyed the two that are played when you launch a campaign and then after character creation. They're fun, they engage you, and they provide context without exhausting you with exposition. When you're satisfied with your character, you're allowed into the game fairly quickly and get a solid tutorial area that allows you to orient yourself with the controls and general flow of gameplay, which is compromised at 3 systems: exploration, engagement, and combat. The main hallmark of the gameplay itself isn't necessarily any of these 3 core gameplay tenets on their own. There are games that are better at exploration, have better stories or environments to engage with, and better combat systems, but it's how the game allows you to seamlessly slip in and out of any of these 3 at any time that really lets the game shine. Getting off of the Mind Flayer ship and into the first act of the game opens the majority of the systems up for full utilization. You explore the crash site, engage with your steadily growing cast of companions, and experience some of your first true combat challenges. This is where I initially began to enjoy the pacing of the game. I got to take advantage of the fluidity of the gameplay cycle. I was allowed to devise a hierarchy of action based on the information the story gave me, and the setting and storytelling supported the order in which I solved problems and completed quests. You're rewarded for engaging in these 3 gameplay systems well. Baldur's Gate 3 does an admirable job of translating 5e's gameplay systems into a modern CRPG. Exploring provides loot and combat interactions. Combat interactions open up exploration and progress quests, and engaging with NPCs provides satisfying story beats and leads you to more exploration. There's plenty of unique and interesting gear to be found through all of this that makes you appreciate interacting with the gameplay cycle. For example, I learned from a group of Dwergar in the Underdark that they're looking for the adamantine forge in the area, which pushed me towards finding it myself, fighting one of the more fun combat encounters in the game, and getting some pretty powerful armor for my class and reward. These interactions where you engage with the game, use that information to explore, and take on an interesting combat with a tangible reward define the physical gameplay elements. Gaining experience and leveling up your class while engaging with this cycle is satisfying as well, with most levels offering marked upgrades that immediately improve your viability in combat. The progress in one level of Baldur's Gate 3 feels comparable to multiple levels in other turn-based RPGs. Combat is serviceable in this game, if not good, and benefits the most from the pacing. Being able to mostly pick and choose when to fight keeps the system from wearing thin on you too early into the game. Not all combat encounters are created equal in this game, and being new to the systems and learning on the fly, it was easy to see where the game went right with certain encounters and where the game falls more flat. You fight in the turn-based tactical system of 5e D&D, and it's serviceable. The combat is at its best when you're fighting condensed groups of similarly leveled or slightly stronger enemies in interesting environments, where your movement, spell selection, target priority, and damage output all play a factor into whether you make it through. It falters though, especially closer to the end of the game as you're finishing multi-act quests like Shadowheart's character quest, or some of the combat interactions you may see in the final stretch of the main story, where you're forced to either deal with large groups of enemies that are a mixture of fodder and formidable, or sit through minutes of friendly and hostile NPC turns while you wait till initiative loops back to you and you can trim off enough enemies to make the combat bearable. It's the weakest of the three core gameplay tenets for sure, but not bad by any means. I found myself seeking out combats at multiple points, especially Act 2, which I think has some interesting locations and some of the best mini-bosses to interact with, yet it's still not the main draw of the game. The balance between rests and fights never felt bad. As long as you're vigilant and tactical with your short rests and consumables, you can generally roll through a couple of combats to open up areas for looting and exploration before retiring to the nearest hub to trade and long rest. Baldur's Gate is comprised of multiple open world style hubs. There are 5 distinct separate areas: the Crash Site, the Mountain Pass, the Underdark, the Shadow-Cursed Lands, and Baldur's Gate, but at least the outer and lower city portions of it anyways. The game is large, but not too large that it's barren of content. Anywhere you can go there's something to do or find, and it feels nice to clear the fog on your map and find fast travel spots. But most of the environments are filled with enough content that you can easily find yourself exploring over half the given area, bouncing from point of interest to quest to combat on foot, before you retreat to your camp to long rest and catch up with your companions. You start at the Nautiloid Crash Site, where you explore the nearby Emerald Grove and the Goblin Camp shortly thereafter. There's plenty to see and do here, and this launching pad into the rest of the game is disguised well. You don't feel railroaded or like you're being taught how to play the game, but that's exactly what the area is designed for, and it does a good job. More games could take note of how Baldur's Gate 3 more or less throws you into its complex systems and lets you figure things out in a lower risk area after the short and sweet introduction in Avernus, instead of inundating you with exposition and tutorials right off the bat. The conflict between the goblins and the druids of the Grove can seem surface level at first, but it quickly develops nuance as you learn more about the Absolute, its grasp on the goblins in the area, and the internal crisis with the druids and the refugees inside the Emerald Grove. It's a tight, nicely designed initial area where you learn about the multiple ways to approach dialogue, combat, and exploration in this game. With how nice the environments you can explore are, one of the more interesting choices you're faced with is how you intend to move out of the first act. The Crash Site and the surrounding areas are only the first half of the first act, and moving into either the Underdark or the Mountain Pass make up the second half of the first act. Either path is not mutually exclusive, one does not lock you out of the other, but on my initial playthrough I chose the Underdark first at the behest of Shadowheart, only then to later grab Lae'zel and clear the Mountain Pass and the Githyanki Crash. This felt significantly better to me, as I felt after I cleared the Dwergar from the mines in the Underdark, I wanted to at least attempt to appease Lae'zel and take her to the Githyanki Crash regardless, and I was rewarded with a fairly interesting Rosy Morn monastery in the area to explore, and that contained a pretty powerful unique weapon to boot. Dealing with Lae'zel and the Githyanki was by far the more engaging of the two paths, with the final boss of the area, the Inquisitor, shaking out as a more satisfying encounter than clearing the mines and taking on another True Soul in Nier, after having already wiped out a goblin camp led by 3 True Souls in the area prior. The story of the Githyanki in Baldur's Gate is one of the more engaging parts, and exploring to find out more about them and Prince Orpheus make up some of the more interesting exploration challenges. It felt weird for Larian to allow you to miss this. I could easily see choosing one path, wrapping it up, and not thinking twice and moving past, missing one of the 2 environments that are each interesting in their own rights. But the game does frequently warn you between acts to wrap everything up, which always pushed me to clear up my journal so I can feel satisfied moving forward. Ultimately though, the freedom is a more important aspect to maintain, and it's a strong choice by Larian to risk content being missed in favor of player choice. I think the game does a good job of convincing you to explore and see as much as you can, rather than manufacture exploration. The Shadow-Cursed lands are the most atmospheric of the 3 environments and contain some of the more interesting locations and pieces of story to uncover. Ketheric Thorm is the most compelling villain you face in the game. He has real motivation and gravitas, and a satisfying story arc that wraps up neatly in the mostly self-contained second act. All the members of the Thorm family you can seek out in the area provide fun interactions and combats, and are really, in my opinion, some of the most well-designed encounters in the game. Unearthing the secrets of the area and the backstory of Ketheric Thorm is some great indirect storytelling. The nature of the Shadow Curse keeps NPC interactions mostly relegated to the Moonrise Towers and Last Light Inn, and there's not as much interaction in terms of finding people and running errands, but it doesn't detract from the area as much, as you'll happen upon interesting locations and encounters like the Morgue, the House of Healing, the Toll House, and the Sharon Temple through following the main quest itself. I wouldn't say the game necessarily picks up here, but it hits a nice stride. You run with the momentum you built from the first act and it feels good. The combat picks up, the quests have a little more scope, and the environment is more engaging. This is where you get the most mileage out of the hours you can burn on in this game. It's almost a shame that the areas are separated so distinctly. The game has more structure from separating things this way, and it already has so much depth and reaction to player actions that being able to go back to the Shadow-Cursed lands and see the result of your actions conceptually would have been a lot to develop. Considering the state of the third act in the game on release, it seems Larian was already in the realm of punching out of its weight class. It's ultimately what stops Baldur's Gate 3 short of perfection. It's weird to measure the merit of a game that does more with the genre than almost any game before it against itself, but the game does betray itself, when the parts that shine so brightly illuminate some of the weaker aspects overall. The third act constitutes of Rivington, Worm's Crossing, and the Lower City, which more or less feel like one environment of their own. I remember playing through the first 2 acts and wondering what Larian had in store for the titular city. It's obvious the third act was cut to an extent, and it does little to top the highs you hit in the first and second act. The city does have life, there are things to do and people to talk to, but the main quest begins to decline, and you're left wanting. Not for more, as the game comes close to overstaying its welcome with the lengthy combats wearing on you as you get deeper into the third act, but maybe a reorganization. I hit the level cap pretty early into Act 3, and it definitely sucks some of the fun out of the main gameplay cycle. It's still nice to explore and fight at max level with all the tools of the game finally at your disposal, but the game loses the edge of the classic level up dopamine chase that can carry other titles, but was more of a bonus than a core gameplay experience here. The exploration, engagement, and combat are still kings, but without the measuring stick of levels to show your progress, they have to stand on their own, which they do fine, but not remarkably. Multiple quests come to a close in Act 3, a few more are introduced, and purely on storylines themselves they wrap up nicely. Larian did a good job with the multi-act quests in this regard, and they carry the third act, providing plenty to do to flesh out the area that doesn't lend as naturally to exploration as the prior environments. Overall, the city doesn't feel great, with the major letdown being the exclusion of the upper city. It falls flat thematically to say the least, as the city is mentioned thoroughly in the previous acts and set up as an epic final frontier in the fight against the Chosen Three and the Elder Brain. But in reality, you're stuck in the middling lower city running through sewers and audience halls dealing with Ornn and Gortash, who hardly measure up to Ketheric Thorm in terms of narrative build-up and payoff. The only clear winner of the area is the House of Hope, which has the most interesting setting and most satisfying boss combat of the area. It was disappointing to see the game significantly falter in the final stretch. I'd be very curious to see what the cut Upper City content would have done for the area overall. I find it hard to say that without some overhaul to some of the more tedious combats and more levels and variety and encounters to play with, that more content on the face would bolster the experience too much. As I stated earlier, the game is a victim of itself. You can visualize the game at its peak potential just by playing it. It comes close to executing the core gameplay mechanics perfectly at times, but never in conjunction. The gameplay is good. It's really good when the systems are clicking, and when it's combined with the great story, it provides an excellent experience and becomes more than the sum of its parts. The story and companions are the main draw of the game, and everything is centered around them. Your desire to interact with everything stems from your motivations to satisfy certain companions and resolve the main story to your liking. The game is a true RPG, and the experience works best when you indulge the game in roleplay. You set yourself into a character and make decisions from their framework, whether or not the character is yourself or someone else entirely, or somewhere in between that. The story isn't a truly deep character analysis, nor does it necessarily contain any deep, unique, grand message. It's closer to a well-crafted choose-your-own-adventure book than a deep, high fantasy novel. This isn't to disparage the game at all, but when the discourse surrounding the game talks about how good the story is, the context on what kind of good story it is often lost. You won't find anything in Baldur's Gate 3 that truly changes your perception, but you will find something that has an adequate amount of depth and careful thought and consideration put into it. And in the medium, that's rare. What makes the story engaging in and of itself is how reactive and malleable it is. The game goes more wide than it does deep, and it works within the framework of the game itself. The story is shallow to an extent because of it, but it can change and react to you easier in return. I'm not implying the game is shallow in and of itself though, not in the pejorative anyhow, but in purely the analytical sense. The companions all have great arcs. Traveling with them, learning more of their backstories and motivations, and having the ability to influence them and shape who they become on your grand adventure is done better in this game than any other game I've played. It is the hallmark of the storytelling by far. Each character has their own respective needs that correlate to their quest, and these quests are some of the best in the game. Each character has a full, unique arc, and resolving them feels natural. The link you share with the Illithid tadpole creates a bond. You're a motley crew bound together, and that cohesion allowed me to care for the characters and their outcomes. The main story itself is anchored mostly around the character of the Emperor. The Emperor is by far the most interesting character in the game by virtue of how reactive he is to the character and how interpretations of him can vary so drastically. His attitude towards the character seems to be shaped by the brief conversations you share. Your dialogue choices change how he speaks about and to you. The Emperor is the adventurer Balduran, one of the founding members of Baldur's Gate, whose thirst for adventure led him to a mind flayer encampment in the Moonrise Towers, where he was infected with a tadpole and eventually underwent seromorphosis and became a mind flayer himself. He escaped his initial enslavement from the Moonrise Elder Brain with the intervention of his friend, the Dragon Answer, who later attempted to kill him in an act of mercy, but was slain by the Emperor instead. He was eventually enslaved again after the Dark Urge and Gortash returned him to the Elder Brain of Moonrise, now the Nether Brain, after the Chosen Three had used the Netherese crown to control it. He escaped the influence of the Nether Brain once again when he was sent to retrieve the Astral Prism, and the link between them was severed by Orpheus's power. The Nether Brain in reality had planned for him to regain his free will and rally the adventurers to retrieve the Nether Stones from the Chosen Three and free it from their control. The Emperor seems utmost concerned with his own survival, as the majority of his actions within his past in the story imply that. Wither states that seromorphosis robs an entity of its soul, so the idea that the Emperor itself is still truly Balduran doesn't seem to be true. The Emperor comes across as either a manipulative entity that is using the crew as a means to avoid enslavement again and ensure his survival, or a benevolent mind flayer intent on destroying the Nether Brain. Whether or not you agree with his continued enslavement of Orpheus as necessary or cruel leads you to either pushing him to join the Netherbrain again after you free Orpheus to avoid his wrath, or partnering with him on the final push to either destroy or control the Netherbrain, allowing him to maintain his independent existence. Choosing to free Orpheus in my initial playthrough felt validating, as watching the Emperor flee back into the clutches of the Netherbrain felt like it proved he was an untrustworthy individual. Whereas when I looked up the ending where you partner with him, I was surprised to see him stay true to his word, and when left to his own devices, resist the temptation to control the brain and simply destroy it. He truly exists somewhere in a neutral gray area. He never really lies to you, but is never forthcoming with the truth. And he operates to further his own self-interest, but not at the detriment of others necessarily. The decisions you make centered around him and freeing Orpheus are the most difficult, and they stick with you long after the ending. The Emperor provides depth to the more run-of-the-mill MacGuffin hunt structure of the main story that pushes it to have that more memorable feeling. Outside of the Emperor and the companions, the rest of the main story is pretty buck-standard high fantasy fanfare. The Dead Three, Baal, Merkel, and Bane, malevolent former gods turned quasi-deities, want to use their chosen three, Ketheric, Orin, and Gortash, to enslave the Elder Brain and raise an army to destroy the world. This leads to the events that happen with the Emperor, culminating in you collecting the 3 Netherstones and deciding the future of the Sword Coast. Its structure is nothing to write home about, but more than anything, the care and design of the world, the endless tidbits of lore you can find, really bolster the setting so much that even though you're engaging in some pretty standard fantasy genre stuff, your immersion doesn't suffer. In fact, it's heightened due to the endless choices and ways you can interact with that story. You could dissect Baldur's Gate 3 for hours. I'm sure there's plenty I missed on my initial playthrough, and I could do 3 more and probably not see everything the game has to offer. There's pure mutations upon pure mutations of ways the game can be experienced, and the game is unique to your run and how you experience it and the decisions you make. That's where Baldur's Gate ultimately succeeds. It translates the feeling of sitting at a table and immersing yourself in a world and a character that is larger than life. It brings you to a fantasy setting. It gives you a reason to stick around and see what it has to offer. While the gameplay may not ultimately excel at one single thing above other games, its marriage of story, gameplay setting, and player choice all blend together to make it something more than any single component. You don't feel like you're just exploring or just experiencing a story. You truly roleplay, and for that, it's hard to argue that Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't reach its vision, even if it can't truly surmount that final hurdle of perfection.